Hey guys, excited to bring you the first video on this channel. So we'll start with chess opening principles for beginners. So if you are starting out in the game of chess and you have never set foot in a tournament hall, or you have mostly just been playing in the family, with your dad or friends, then this video will teach you how to get a good start to the game. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So if you notice, I have listed down some do's and don'ts, and I will go through them using the chessboard and give you some examples of what each of those mean. Okay, so the first most important principle is to control the center. So when we are starting out a game of chess, we need to pay attention to the center of the board, especially these four squares that I have highlighted, namely d4, e4, d5, and e5. So these squares are of supreme importance. Now, the reason is that if your pieces are controlling the center and close to the center, then they have a easier time getting to different parts of the board versus if your pieces are concentrated on some other non-central part of the board. Okay, so how do we do that? As a to start out the game, we should put pawns in the center to start out. So I would recommend playing e4 or d4 to start with. So in both cases, you are occupying a central square, and also you are controlling squares in the opponent's half of the board. So for example, let's say you play e4, you will be controlling this f5 and d5 squares. Okay, and same with the case with d4. Now you are controlling the c5 and e5 squares. And in case, let's say, you get a chance to put both the pawns in the center, let's say a case like this, now you are controlling all four of these squares. And if you notice, these four squares are in black's half of the board. So if I was to draw a line like this, okay, not quite like that, but you get the point, a line horizontally across the board, then the below the line is white's half and above the line is black's half. And you can see by putting two pawns in the middle like this side by side, we have managed to control four squares that are in black's half of the board. Okay, so also not only that, but when we develop our pieces, which is our second point here on the right, uh, you want to develop the pieces in such a way that they have some influence in the center. Okay, so also you want to develop them as quickly as possible, so you don't want to waste time. Okay, so let's give an example of what might not be a good strategy. So often what beginner players will do is, let's say they get started and they may want to first of all, actually they may want to push pawns on the side of the board and not develop in the center. And they may have the idea that they want to get the rook in the game, but this is not a good start to the game because it violates the principle of controlling the center. And also not only that, uh, this plan of getting the rook out can easily be thwarted by black by simply making a move in the center. And if you notice, the rook can be captured by the bishop and white will lose an exchange. Okay, so you want to play in the center. So let's suppose you play e4, and let's say black plays some substandard moves. Let's say he plays h6. Black is not aware of these principles and plays a move that does not control the center or also does not help any of his pieces in getting out, in getting developed. Now, if given a chance to put two pawns in the center on e4 and d4, you should do that. The same goes for black. If you are playing black, you would put the pawns on e5 and d5. Okay, so uh, once you have put one or two pawns in the middle, let's continue with black just pushing pawns for illustration purposes. Now what you want to do next is develop the pieces quickly. So especially I'm talking about the minor pieces, which is the knights and the bishops. Okay, so you want to get the knights and the bishops involved in the game as quickly as possible. Okay, and not waste time doing that. Okay, so where would these pieces go? The knights would like to go towards the center. So f3 for this knight and c3 for the other knight would be good place. So if you were to continue with black pushing pawns, let's say now you can put this bishop on this very nice diagonal. And notice how all of my pieces are having control in the center. This knight is influencing e5 and d4. This bishop is controlling the central square uh, d5. And similarly, this knight, when I put it on c3, will be controlling e4 and d5. So all of my minor pieces, the way I'm developing, they are controlling the center. Now it is not necessary to uh, have all of them directly look at the central squares, but it is important that, especially for the knights, you want to develop them close to the center. So with that logic, developing the knight on the edge of the board will not be good, because it is on the side away from the center and not controlling the center. And also, because the knight is a short range piece, meaning it can only go so far in one move, it cannot travel across the board like a queen or rook or a bishop. So because of that, the knights are effective when they are close to the site of action, and often the site of action will be unknown in the beginning of the game, but having them close to the center is a good strategy, because from the center they can jump around to whatever part of the board they are needed. Okay, also there is a saying in chess, a knight on the rim is dim, so be very wary of putting your knights on the edge of the board. Okay, also, yeah, so similarly, putting the knight on e2 will not be as great, because you hinder development of your own bishop, and also it's not the most active square for the knight. But we will come to this example, this particular point later. So develop your pieces quickly. Okay, you want to make sure that all your pieces come out in the game very quickly, and so treat this game of chess as symbolizing a war between two armies. Okay, so the white army, these all these pawns and pieces are the different soldiers and forces that white has, and same goes with black. Okay, and this is the battlefield. Okay, say this area, and you can consider the back ranks to be the homes, where the soldiers are resting. So you want to make sure all your forces join the battle and enter the battlefield pretty quickly. Okay, so meaning you want to make sure that you develop your pieces quickly. So if you do not develop your pieces, you keep them on the back ranks and you keep playing different pawn moves and wasting time, and your opponent does get all his pieces out in the game, then using those pieces, he'll be able to generate an attack and probably score a quick victory, which of course we do not want that to happen. Okay, so far we have learned that in the opening, the first important thing is to control the center. The second most important thing is to get all our pieces out. So, you know, for example, bishop to c4, knight to c3, let's say this bishop to e3 or f4. And these squares that I'm showing are not set in stone. They are more a matter of example of how you should be thinking about your pieces and making sure that they are placed and developed as actively as possible, where they can have the maximum impact and participation in the game, where they are not left behind not doing anything. Okay, you want to make sure. So think of yourself as the general of an army, and you want to make sure all your forces, all your men are being deployed and used to their maximum. You don't want soldiers just sitting back idling around while your enemy is trying to attack you. Okay, okay, the next principle is you want to castle quickly to protect the king. So yeah, I keep pulling the pieces back. I should not do that. So going forward with our example, where black is making only pawn moves. So after, let's say white has developed all his minor pieces now. So the two bishops, the two knights are both developed. Now one of the next things is white needs to get his king to safety, which can be achieved via castling. So uh, a question that often comes from my students and beginner players that I've seen is, how does castling help exactly? Like, what does castling achieve? Now, it is very important to understand what exactly is achieved by castling, because otherwise you wouldn't be motivated to castle. So I have seen a lot of players who delay castling or don't think that castling is of any importance, because they do not really have a good understanding over why we need to castle in the first place. So the reason for castling is, if you look at all the pawns, we have pushed these two pawns in the center, okay, and at some point there will be some pawn break. So let's say at some point white may play a move like d5 or e5, in which case some pawns may get traded, and the larger point is that the center will become open. Okay, you see the central files are now a little bit more open than they were before. So compare this position with this position right here, a bit more open. And as the game progresses and the center opens up, your king, if it's stuck on this e1 square, will come under attack, will feel vulnerable, okay, will be open to attack from the different black pieces which will then be developed. So that's why, if we are planning to open the center up, we want to make sure that we park our king in a spot where it can be safe. So hence we castle to get our king on the king side, where it's away from the center, which is about to get open. Now, who exactly is protecting the king? Who is providing that safety? In fact, it is these three pawns. That is the important detail that will help you if you understand this. Okay, so the pawns in front of the king are what are protecting the king. So when you castle, you want to make sure that there are pawns in front of the king that can protect. And also, once you have castled, you want to make sure that these three pawns remain intact. Or, if you have to move these pawns, you don't want to move them recklessly. So, to give you an example, I'll remove all these highlights. Let's say black continues pushing pawns. And an example of a reckless move would be g4. So let's say you play g4. Now what's the harm? Now if you see, the harm is the king has become a bit more open. Let's say black plays e5, just as an illustration, okay? Now let's say white moves their king and black captures this pawn. Now you see, by virtue of playing g4, you exposed your pawn, that was supposed to protect the king, to an attack by the enemy piece. So the bishop was able to attack the pawn, and because of some careless play by white, it got captured, and now suddenly there is a opening leading to the king. Now this particular position, the king is not in big danger, but you can imagine, as the game develops and black is able to get some of his forces around this part of the board, the king may feel the heat, because his protection, his shield, has now got a hole in it. Okay, so it's important to understand that these pawns are what protect the king when you're castling. And so you should decide whether or not you should castle king side or queen side. One of the factors in that decision should be whether my pawn structure has been compromised. So if you have already played moves like h4, h4 and g4, and you have pushed the pawns on this side, then it makes sense to not castle on the king side, because your king will not have that safety. So in that case, you may decide to castle queen side and park your king there, because these three pawns are still going to provide some safety. Okay, so that is about castling. Okay, Okay, so moving on to some of the don'ts. So let me bring up the do's and don'ts again, and you can see what are the points we'll be covering. So here we have it. So these are common mistakes that I've seen, players who are just starting out make, and we should know that when starting this game, a game of chess, you don't want to make these mistakes. And if you keep these do's and don'ts in your mind, it will help you out. So do not move the same piece twice without good reason. Uh, let's flip over to the chessboard, and I will show you each of these. So not to move the same piece twice. So let's say you are starting out a game, something like this. And so far, White has been following the principles we already discussed. He has put a pawn in the center. This knight on f3 is controlling the central squares. e5 and d4. This bishop is developed, and he has not wasted any time. And let's say, you know, black also is developing reasonably. Let's say both sides have castled. As we discussed, castling is important to protect the king. And in a position like this, uh, let's say black decides that he would like to do something aggressive with this knight, the knight on f6. And he plays this move, knight to g4. Now, as a beginner, you may think that, okay, I'm advancing my knight into the opponent's position, and it's going to be useful, and it's going to attack something, and you may feel good about playing an aggressive move like this. So let me flip the board as black. Black just played knight to g4, moving the same piece again, by the way. So this knight on f6, it's already developed, and one piece that is not developed is this bishop, this knight, this queen. You can think about the rook. These are pieces that have not moved at all since the start of the game. Our king has moved, the other rook has moved, the bishop on e7 has moved. So these four pieces have not been developed at all. In all these moves that have transpired, they have not been developed. And so instead of developing one of these remaining pieces, black decided that he's gonna make another move with the same knight that was already developed. Now, this is not a good strategy, guys. So the reason for that is, remember the analogy I had provided some time back about chess symbolizing a war. So these are your forces: the queen, the bishop, the knight, the rook, the pieces highlighted in red. These are your forces that are, back home, not participating in the war. And instead of sending all your men to the battlefield, you are just, you know, uh, fighting with one or two men, which is, not very logical. So that is one way of understanding it. And so instead, what is better is, what will be much more productive is if black developed some of these pieces. So for example, knight to c6, getting this knight off the back rank and getting this involved in the game. Let's say white does play correctly, and now see how harmoniously white has been developing the pieces. Every single minor piece of white, minor pieces meaning the knight and the bishops. So both the knights and the bishops have been developed by white, and also white has castle. That's because white has not wasted any time. Okay, so as black, you want to be doing the same. So let's say now you can bring your bishop out. Okay, and you see, this way we have accomplished much more. Now we have gotten in the two moves that we spent. We got this knight out, this bishop out, versus, imagine the alternative. You move this knight out, white push this knight back, and then you realized, oh, I can't really do anything here. If I capture this, I just get captured. If I go to h2, I get captured. If I go to e3, I get captured, and I also help him develop another piece. So the best thing I have to do is to retreat, and retreating here to h6 means that I will allow white to capture my knight, in which case I'll have to recapture with this pawn. And reverting back to the point that I had made up before this about why we castle, remember the role of these three pawns. So you want these three pawns to be uh, shielding the king, but now these two pawns are okay, but this pawn is not shielding the king anymore, and in fact there is this open route leading from the king outward, which could be used and exploited by white to create some threats against the king. So that's why you should be very wary of a move like knight to h6, especially because this capture by white forces you to compromise your king position. Once you have castled, you want to make sure that these three pawns remain intact and remain in a position where they can continue to provide protection for your king. Okay. Oops, sorry. Let's go back to the position. So instead of knight to h6, a better retreat would be knight to f6. And see what has happened. We have still invested the same two moves that we did a while back, but instead of developing two of our pieces, the two moves I'm talking about is black went knight to g4, and then next move when it was attacked, he went knight back to f6. Instead of that, in the same time, in the same amount of moves, he could have developed two of his pieces, which would have been much, much more useful and productive for his position. Okay, so yeah, so do not move the same piece twice without a good reason. So what could be a good reason? So imagine if, let's say, you decide that, okay, you would like to challenge this strong bishop of whites, and you want to develop your bishop on e6, which is all right. You are accepting that you will get double pawns, which, and you have weighed the consequences and you decide that this is okay. Now let's say you play bishop to e6, and now white goes ahead and plays this move g4. Now this bishop and this knight both have already been developed, right? They are already out, they are not sitting on the back row. So in terms of developing quickly, the principle that I outlined some time back, it would be logical to probably move the queen next, develop the queen, connect the rooks. But this is a place where we will break our rule, because there is a pawn that's available for us to take on g4. That's for free. White just made a move which gave us a pawn for free, and not only just any pawn, it's a pawn in front of his king. And so what we should do is we should strongly consider capturing this pawn. We should evaluate the consequences about what might happen if we take the pawn, and then if we see that there are no dangerous consequences for us, we should go ahead and take the pawn. Now you see, by doing this, by taking the pawn, let me remove all the highlights. Let's go back. Sorry about that. What is the other variation? Okay, that's fine. So by doing this, by capturing the pawn again, I moved my bishop twice, but I did so because of a very good reason. Okay, I didn't do that without a purpose, which is the key difference between this move and the previous knight to g4 move that I just showed. Okay, so if there is a very good reason, if you are able to capture something of value, or you are able to significantly uh, worsen your opponent's position, create significant threats, or checkmate him in a few moves, then you should break these rules and go ahead and move the same piece twice. But unless such an opportunity exists, you should just stick to the fundamentals and focus on getting your army mobilized quickly. Okay, so that is the first don't point that I wanted to discuss. The second one that I have seen also often is do not block your bishop with your pawns. So if I go back here, so I've seen many players, you know, employ a development scheme, a way of organizing their pieces where they are not aware of the impact that their pawns are having over their pieces. So what do I mean by that? Let's say white starts off with e4 and you playing black respond with e6. Now white takes over the center. e6 is a well-known opening, by the way. It's called the French defense, and yeah, it's not a bad move by any means. Now you play d6, and for whatever reason you decide, okay, you are going to be pushing these two pawns, and while you are controlling a lot of central squares, no question about it, you are controlling a lot of central squares, uh, but oh, sorry about that. I need to learn my keyboard shortcuts on chessbase. Sorry, I keep flipping. Okay, so this is the position. So while you are controlling these squares, central squares, but you did not consider the impact that these pawns are having on your pieces. So if I ask you, which pieces do you think are not happy that the pawns are on e6 and d6? You can take a moment. Now, if you said your bishops, you would be correct. So if you see the bishops, both of them are now blocked by your own pawns. And this is something that you need to be very aware of. Now, pawn moves cannot be taken back. They can move forward, but they cannot go back. So pawn moves are very committal. So anytime you make a pawn move, you need to consider it uh, ahead of time, in advance, before you move that pawn. Okay, so you need to be very intentional about moving your pawns, and especially if you create a situation where your bishops are firmly locked in inside your pawns, then it may end up not having a future for the rest of the game. Okay, and such a scenario is called a bad bishop, and you want to avoid having bad pieces, you know but on purpose. So this is like an unforced error, right? In tennis, your opponent didn't do anything to make this happen. This is something you did to yourself. So this is something we need to avoid. Okay. 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 So then, next point. Next point is to not leave any pieces unused. So it is basically the same point that I made earlier, but in terms of what you shouldn't do uh, is don't make sure that all your pieces are being used. There shouldn't be a knight or a bishop that you just don't develop. So to give you an example again, let's say you play an opening something like this. uh, let's say, okay, and it's reasonable. uh, and now uh, let's say you start pushing pawns. Okay, now which pieces do you think are not being developed? Well, this knight, of course, right? This poor knight has not been developed, and because of that, the rook, this rook is not able to come into the game effectively. It may make a rook lift along this line, and that may be possible, may or may not be good. But the larger point is you should be thinking about all your pieces and make sure that all your pieces are getting into the game as quickly as possible. Remember the war analogy, okay? You don't want to be left behind and left in a situation where your opponent is using all of their men, all of their army in the battlefield, while some of your soldiers are back home, taking a nap. So just use all your pieces, all right? Okay, so now the next point, which can be highlighted with this example, so is a lot of beginners will make moves, unnecessary pawn moves like h3. Now they will make these moves. Let me flip the board to discourage their opponents from, let's say, putting a bishop on g4 or putting a knight on g4, and that's how they would justify it. So let's say a bishop, now black develops their knight here, they would play a3, and their rationale is, oh, I don't want this knight to get aggressive and come to b4. Now these moves are time wasting moves, okay? These pawn moves did not help develop any pieces, because if you notice, white's bishop back here is still undeveloped, okay? And so when you have pieces that need to be developed, you should not be wasting your time uh, on these pawn moves, okay? So that is very important, and that's not to say that these pawn moves like h3 or a3 are never ever useful, but you should only play such pawn moves when you are preventing a very concrete threat. Here, for example, in this position, h3 need not be played. Like knight g4 is not a strong threat, and bishop g4 is not a strong threat because this bishop already has moved, the one on d7. And if black wants to waste another tempo to move his bishop to g4, so be it. Once the bishop appears on g4, you can play h3, and in that case, it'll be with tempo. You will ask the question to the bishop and make it determine whether or not he wants to make a capture on f3, capture your knight, or he wants to retreat. But playing this in advance, just to prevent these threats, is a time wasting move. So do not make unnecessary pawn moves. So this is another idea that you should be aware of, that your pieces need to be developed, but your pawns do not need to be developed. So when we talk about developing quickly, we are talking about your pieces, not your pawns, okay? So the pawns are uh, there to help your pieces, but you need not push every single pawn down the board. uh, that's not required to play a good game, okay? You should use your pawns much more intentionally and strategically, and because, as I said, pawns cannot come back. So yeah, do not push your pawns unnecessarily. Now the last point that I wanted to make in this opening principles video is, a lot of players follow a system, you know meaning an opening system, a system of moves, which they have learned from a book or a website, or their friend told them, or somebody, and with good intentions. And also, systems, knowing some systems, knowing an easy opening is great. It gives you a good start, and you feel confident. You know that what my first 5 or 6 or 8 moves are going to be. Now when you do that, you have to make sure you don't do that mindlessly, meaning you have to be constantly paying attention to what your opponent is doing. So to illustrate this point, I will take the example of the super popular London system, which, by the way, the London system is a great opening. I recommend it. I played sometimes myself, and I mean, you know, like, even strong players like Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, plays the London system. So this is this is not to throw any shade on the London system. This is me just making a point about paying attention to your opponent's moves. So let's say you're white and you have learned the London system, and let's say your opponent, you start with d4 because these are the moves. Let's say you go bishop f4. Your opponent also develops in a reasonable way, knight to f3. Opponent opponent kind of copies you, bishop to f5, e3, and let's say you go knight to b to d2, and here you go c3. Now when you go c3, now you are shocked when your opponent just you know plumps his knight upon c2, and it's a fork between your rook and the king. Now the reason this happened wasn't because the London system is a horrible opening, but because when the when the knight came to c6, you didn't realize that knight to b4 is a strong possibility, and when the knight came to b4, you didn't realize that he could actually be threatening something. So you were just mindlessly following a system. Okay, so instead of doing that, you could still play the London, and to prevent this knight to b4 ideas, you could just change your move order and play c3 right away, which is part of your London plan, but you are just being aware of what your opponent wants to do, and preventing what needs to be prevented. Okay, preventing any ideas that may be unpleasant for you. Yeah, and now you still get to play in London, but all your pieces stay alive, and you do not lose any material, and you have every chance in the world to win this game. Yeah. Okay, guys. So those are the tips that I wanted to share. Hopefully, these ideas, these do's and don'ts, will help you out in your games. And if you have any comments or any feedback, and if any of these ideas help you, let me know down in the comments, and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.